Hi, everyone. This is Ruth Theresa with One Inspiring Woman, and tonight we are doing Thursday Night Live. This is a subject that is kind of near and dear to me. So if you are clicking in, let me know where you're clicking in from. This is something that I think a lot of families go through, a lot of different stages of grief, but kind of how to balance that grief with everybody else's grief. And I know for a lot of families, it's something that we're dealing with a lot. I've talked to many of my clients that will tell me that this time of year, no matter when their family member passed or anything else, that they'll tell me that like the holidays are the worst. It's like they would be here for this celebration, or they would be here for this, or they would be doing this, or they would be cooking that, or whatever it is. And I just know that so many people just get overwhelmed this time of year because of grief. And then you're kind of like dealing with your grief. Hello, Miss Debbie, dealing with your grief on top of like the other members of your family. And some families are just more understanding, like everybody grieves in their own process or everybody grieves in their own way. But I will tell you that one of the things is sometimes family members, especially when it's kind of like the person hasn't been gone all that long, a lot of times family members will get into that kind of like that anger of it. It's like, I'm mad that you're not grieving at the same pace I am, or I'm mad that you're not grieving the same way I am. And I think a lot of times when people are grieving, they go through different stages and they go through kind of some of the stages very quickly. And then sometimes they go through them very slowly. Now, if you are like me, I am a doer. When I get overwhelmed, I just get into action. So when I hear that a family member has passed or that sort of thing, or when I've had to deal with this in the past, what ends up happening for me is I'm like, we need to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And I'm just going and going and going and flowing with all of this. And I kind of push off like my own grieving off for long periods of time because it's just not easy. It's not comfortable grieving or going through that process when to me, it's like there's so much that has to be done. And so that can be really overwhelming for a lot of people. So I think this is important to kind of talk to. We're going to talk about this and kind of not necessarily moving through each stage, but kind of like how it balance each of these stages. So there are 5 stages to grief. And the first one is denial. And I think a lot of times it kind of helps us kind of like, it's not really happening, or it's not real, or you're just making this up. I dealt with this a lot when I've had family members that have passed, and almost like, what? Why are you telling me that this happened? It's just one of those, like, it's such a shock to our system that we're in denial. Like, well, this is a really bad joke. Why would you be telling me this? Or, tell me the truth, or whatever it is. And so a lot of people go through that shock. And sometimes that shock kind of like literally shuts them down. The shock and the denial of it really put that person in a survival mode. And so they get into survival mode and they can't really get out of it. A lot of times, like, it's just like they're going through the motions, but they're really kind of like, they're not there. They're not really a part of what's going on. And this is just, like I said, it's kind of just one of the ways that people kind of deal with this. But I will tell you, it's not really a healthy way to kind of shut this all down. I think it's kind of like I said, everybody grieves in their own way. Kind of how do they deal with stuff? How do they deal with that? But I think I probably deal with more people that are going through a lot of grief and loss because of what I do for a business, but it's one of those, it can be really overwhelming. And I will tell you that kind of people will get stuck in this stage, and you may see people even weeks or months afterwards, after hearing that someone had passed, they're still kind of in that realm of like denial. Now, the second one is really talking about is anger. A lot of people go through the angry stage, and I think this is kind of where they get angry at other people. It's like, well, you didn't go through the denial part, you're just in this part, or you're in the doing part, but you didn't go through this. And so I think that's kind of where a lot of people get mistaken. It's just one of the processes of how someone deals with like someone passing, the more you truly kind of work through what you are feeling, I think it makes it better. It doesn't make it easier. It just makes it a little bit better. But a lot of times this anger, because it's one of those, a lot of people don't want to point that at themselves. They'll end up pointing it at other family members. Well, you're not grieving because you're not acting the way I'm acting, or you're not reacting the way I'm reacting at the same time. And like I said, a lot of people grieve at different processes. I will tell you on average that I have found it probably takes anyone like 2 to 5 years to kind of grieve a loss. That's really kind of like an important one. If you're joining in, tell me where you're joining in from. And if you've had a loss, it's one of those, I think a lot of people are dealing with this because over the last couple of years, we've had major losses, a lot of people passing from COVID and other issues coming up at the same time. So it's kind of like people have been going through a lot of grieving all at the same time. I think there's many issues under the anger. I think one of the things is they, like I said, they don't want to turn it in on themselves, but they'll turn it out towards everybody else. I'm mad at everybody else because you're not grieving the way I want you to, or you're not dealing with things the way I want you to, or, don't tell me that God had something to do with this or that sort of thing. So a lot of people kind of get in that very angry stage. And I know for a lot of people, it ends up being like a source of strength eventually, but it's one of those at the beginning that anger usually points out towards everybody else and kind of what everybody else is dealing with or going through at this time. Grief always feels like being lost at sea, but it's one of those, a lot of times, like no one else knows what I'm going through, or no one else has ever lost this person or that person. No, they haven't. They've never lost in the same way. They've never had that same connection that you had with your mother or your father or your brother or your sister when they're going through the grieving process. So a lot of times this is kind of, everybody's kind of going through this at a different stage, but a lot of times like people feel like they're the only one. And I think this is really one of those best answers is a lot of times when someone is going through the grieving process, to really understand is that each person in that person's life, you know what I'm saying, even if that mother, just say, had 10 kids, each of those 10 kids would have had their own relationship with her. So it's one of those, like, even though everybody's lost their mom, it's one of those, everybody lost a different person to them. So maybe one of them is really, really close to their mom. Maybe one of them is not as close to their mom. Maybe one of them, it's one of those. And it also really depends on who you are in the family. Like, are you the oldest, the middle, the youngest child? All of those kind of grieve a little bit differently. The next stage that people go through is bargaining. And usually you see this kind of in the process of like, don't take my wife, my husband, my spouse, don't take my child, don't take this person, that sort of thing. And you see them really kind of like, if you let them stay, I'll do this. And so you have a lot of that anger issues or bargaining issues of like, if you do this, I'll change this. If you do this, I'll stop smoking. If you do this, I'll stop drinking. If you do this, if you let them stay, I'll change all these things. And it's one of those, it really comes out to a lot of what ifs. What if I change this? What if I did this differently? And it doesn't make it easier. It just kind of prolongs some of that energy. But it's one of those, bargaining is usually something that happens when you know the person is going to pass. It doesn't really help when the person passes like in a car accident or very quickly or a heart attack or something like that. It doesn't help with that part. But if you know that the person is going to pass, if you know, kind of like, okay, they're sick and they're getting worse and that sort of thing, and you kind of know like this is eventually going to happen, a lot of times people will spend a lot of time in that bargaining phase. I'll just sneeze. One of the next one is a lot of people have, like, if they're bargaining a lot, you know what I'm saying? To me, it's one of those, I feel a lot of their grief, a lot of like this grief and pain, feeling guilty that they can't change the circumstances, that they couldn't do anything to help their family member. So I feel like that's just one of those, like, wow, this is really amazing. Next one is really depression. And I really feel like this happens usually kind of as people move through the stages of grief, they will get into that depressive stage. Like, I miss them so much. And a lot of times this is the stage that people kind of like hunker down in and will stay in this energy for a long period of time. And it really depends. It's one of those, you have literally people feeling empty, feeling like grief enters like different levels. So some days they'll like, I can't get up or I can't do anything. Other times it's one of those, they're almost like they kind of forgot. And it's like all of a sudden it will hit them like 10 minutes after they're up, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was laughing. They're still gone. And so they almost have like that grief within them, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I was happy for 5 seconds. And so a lot of them kind of deal with this really depressive stage, and they almost beat themselves up more than anybody else. So it's kind of like, wow, this is really harsh what people do. And I understand it. It's one of those, it can be very overwhelming. If you are joining in, you can let me know kind of if you've gone through these, kind of if you've had family members that have been dealing with this. Like I have dealt with so many families that when someone passes, they get so overwhelmed or stuck in the grief process, and then their families really don't understand kind of like, what are you going through? One of the last stages is, I think it's the last stage. Yes, it is acceptance. And that usually comes years down the road of like, being okay. And I often tell people, you will never get over completely a loss. You will never kind of get over that. You kind of learn how to live around it. And it's one of those, that hole is still in your heart, that, you know, hole in your family is always there. Yet I will tell you that you will kind of learn to kind of accept it, and you'll always feel that loss, but you will learn how to kind of live in a new kind of normal way of kind of maintaining your life without that person. And I will tell you that it's something that I was talking to a client the other day, and she was saying, I think her mom has been past like 22, 23 years, something like that. And she said, almost every day I want to wake up and call my mom. And she goes, it takes me a few moments of just like, oh my gosh, she's really not here. She really has gone. And I was like, that's the acceptance of it, but kind of like almost a little bit of that denial as well, as like, oh my gosh, my life is normal. And then it kind of hits her at some point, like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. And it's a forever change. Nothing's going to readjust. Nothing's ever going to kind of completely let this role go or anything else. It's one of those, like, you're going to learn how to accept it and kind of end up loving yourself through all of this. One of the things that I really kind of deal with a lot is like family members, and a lot of times I deal with this in group readings. So a lot of times when people will do a group reading, they'll tell me like, grandma passed or mom passed or so and so passed, aunt, uncle, whatever it is, passed, and we want to do a group reading to connect to them. And a lot of times as they, you know what I'm saying, as I do something like that, I can feel kind of like they're like trying to be present for them, trying to kind of listen, for the love. Because a lot of times, like, people think, well, oh, you didn't love them because you're not as upset as I am, or you didn't do this because I'm doing it differently. But I will tell you that that's just one of those issues that people live with constantly. But it's one of those, kind of the best thing to do is kind of listen. Even if you've lost a family member, allow them to voice it out and allow their, grief to be different than yours, and to understand that it's not about judgment. It's not about, I cried more than you, or I did this differently from you, or I was upset over this, or whatever it is, or I wanted everybody's everything. And it's one of those, just know that it kind of helps them kind of get through the loss, just listening to them. So just acknowledge that the person is in pain. And even if you're, I had a client the other day, I was like, no matter what, like, no matter when you've lost someone in your family, it's one of those, even if your brother and sister lost their mom as well, it's one of those, their loss is different from yours. So acknowledge that y'all had a different relationship. And it's okay to have that difference with people. A lot of people really think like, oh my gosh, everybody has to express grief in the same way that I have. One of the things that I will tell you is kind of acknowledging the person's inner pain is what we're talking about, is kind of like, it's okay to acknowledge if you've never lost your mom. If you're telling someone else it'll be okay because they've lost their mom, it doesn't help. It really doesn't. So just acknowledge, I have no words that are going to make this better. I have no words that are going to make this feel bad, but I'll sit here and hold your hand while you cry. Sometimes that's the best answer for anything, is I will be here in your sadness. I'll help you kind of work through things, even if you've lost someone as well. Talking about the loved one is something that I think is done way too little. A lot of times family members don't want to talk about that loved one. It's almost like, don't say it, because then we're going to realize that grandma isn't here anymore, or dad isn't here anymore, grandpa isn't here anymore. And so a lot of times, like, people kind of like put that aside, like, don't say anything about that. But I will tell you that a lot of times those can be the funniest things. And telling the memories of, like, oh my gosh, I remember when so and so did this, I remember I thought it was so funny, or whatever it is. And I think it really does help a lot of people grieve and kind of move through that grief in a different way. So kind of talking about the person. And I'll kind of give you a secret. The secret is, talk to them, talk about them as they were alive. It's one of those, talk about them in the same way. Because a lot of times, like, when someone's passed, people will be like, oh, they were perfect, they were all that kind of stuff. No, they were a human being, and they had good points and bad points. And maybe they didn't sing very well, and you can make a joke about that, or whatever it is. But, like, be really honest with that, and be very forthright with, like, the memories that you have coming forward for that person, because it really does make it easier. And I really think it makes it easier on the kids that are dealing with this more than anything else. That is something that a lot of people really kind of deal with. And a lot of times, like, especially the kids, don't feel like if the parents or the other people aren't voicing anything, they don't feel like they can. The next one is kind of like, be real about it. Be real about who they were, what they meant to you. Don't minimize anybody's loss, or any denial, or any, like, oh my gosh, anybody else's grief is any less than anyone else. Just understand everybody's going through the grieving process at a different pace because of who that person was to them. I will tell you that time heals all wounds, but it may be really a true statement, but I guarantee you it really doesn't help someone kind of in the grieving process. I think a lot of times people will say that, and it really is hurtful, because it's like, right now there's so much in their pain or their grief that they really can't see that part of it. It's okay to talk about that person. It's okay to, like, acknowledge that person, but also be realistic of where they are in what process of grief. One of the things I think is kind of like my last one to talk about, and then if y'all have any grieving stories, or you want to ask me anything, I will definitely answer those. Kind of showing up for the person. A lot of times when someone goes through a loss, whoever that is, family member, pet, but sneezing, sorry. Nearly everybody who goes through the grieving process requires help and assistance. Sometimes that's like taking care of things that other person would have been taking care of pets or meals or something like that. And a lot of people really come on board at the beginning to kind of really help with this. But usually after a period of time, then those kind of slow down. And that's really a lot of times when people are in the hardest part of the grieving process, and they get stuck a lot. I think that is kind of one of the interesting things for me. It's like, a lot of times people will be around, especially the first week or the first month. And then usually by the second month, they're really not coming around as often. And then by the third month or so, they're kind of like, but you still have so much grieving and so much loss to go through, or kind of verbalize at that point. I think it's really important to understand where someone is in the grieving process, and really kind of like, how long have they been in that step, because you should be somewhat moving through each phase, some of them faster than others, but kind of keeping an eye on that can be really helpful. I am going to do some angel cards, kind of stepping us through a little bit of the grieving process, and kind of getting our angel's perspective of helping us through the grieving process. Now, I will tell you, next week on Thursday Night Live, I will be doing something very, very special. I'm really excited about. I have not done it in quite a while. I will be doing answering your questions. So I'm very excited about that part. I love it. It's kind of, I'm thinking of it as like my Christmas gift to everybody who shows up, kind of like everybody who gets to show up. I get to answer questions from everybody. Everybody gets a chance to get one question answered. So let's start with a couple of angel cards. This one is coming up forward, and this is Serenity. I think this is what really people are desiring when someone passes. They're kind of hoping to kind of get through the grieving process and find that peace, that harmony in what's going on. And a lot of times it doesn't come as quickly as people really require it to be, or kind of as much as they really need it. And a lot of times, like I said, sometimes people will be like, time heals all wounds, and it's really not the time to hear all of that. Sometimes you have to be ready for that in different people. A lot of times I will tell you that because I'm psychic, I get that a lot of people get messages. A lot of times when a family member passes, they will come back and I often say it's kind of like a text message. If I was driving somewhere and I wanted to let someone in my family know, I'd text them back and be like, hey, I want to let you know I got here. So a lot of times, usually within the first probably 72 hours or so, first couple of days, they will send a message. Usually it's them on some type of moving vehicle. Sometimes it's a horse, a plane, a train. A lot of times it's a motorcycle, a car, all that kind of stuff. And they'll kind of drive up and just kind of one of those, I made it, or I'm here, or I'm okay. And it's really their message to say, hey, I'm here, and hey, I'm connected to you. And I've made it, kind of like that text message back, like, hey, I just want to let you know I made it where I was supposed to go. And they're just letting you know that they've made it through the process. They've kind of checked in, that sort of thing, and they're in that process. The next one is study. And I will tell you that a lot of times, like when you really start studying kind of your messages after someone passes, that's always an interesting one. Kind of like, what are they willing to come and talk to you about or tell you about? But also study what messages other people get, because a lot of times they're going to really put that towards what you really require hearing. You really require hearing one thing, and someone else may require hearing something else. And so that's kind of one of those like, what do you require hearing differently from someone else? And that can really come forward in like a very personal message for you of just like listening to that. So study as other people talk about, like, oh, Uncle so-and-so gave me a message of this, or so-and-so came through with this message. That's a really cool one. Archangels. A lot of times our archangels stay with that person until they're all like checked in. I almost can't say it's like checking into hotels, kind of checking into heaven. It's kind of like there is a lot of energy involved. There is a lot of kind of like getting there, that sort of thing. And not everybody checks in at the same pace. I think a lot of times when people pass from something that they know is going to cause them to pass, they're more likely to kind of be accepting of that and move into that process easier. But if someone passes really quickly, like I said, from like a heart attack or a car accident or something else, like they were here and then they were gone. I had dealing with a client the other day that's her nephew was shot in a drive-by shooting, and he was just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so she was asking, like, this was like 3 or 4 days after he had passed, and she was like, has he kind of gotten up there yet? Is he okay? And I said, a lot of times they linger for a while because they're kind of walking around like, what happened? What happened? Where am I at? Kind of just trying to figure out like what the heck just happened. I did have a client that we actually had to go to the location where her cousin had been killed, and he was killed in a train accident. But I thought it was kind of one of those like interesting ones. Like we had to go to the location because he was still stuck there. He was still wandering around going like, oh my gosh, what happened? And this is like 6 months after he had already passed. So he was still just kind of wandering around in that area. And she was so terrified of him becoming like a ghost and not ever getting better or feeling better with his energy. And so she was just like, I just know that he just needs to be okay. I need to know that he's all right with all of this. So we went and got him. Nature. One of the things is, nature is, we're all going to pass someday. We're all going to get there someday. Hopefully it's not today or tomorrow, but it's one of those, we all get there. And I think that's kind of the fun part. Kind of the natural thing for me is a lot of times when someone passes, the family members that even if the person doesn't know, a lot of times like the family members that have already passed, if their parents have passed, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever that is, anybody who's passed in their family ahead of time, is there with them. When they pass, they're there when they're kind of like checking into heaven and kind of checking into things. So they are around them, helping them and assisting them and being there as their support system. That can be really helpful for a lot of people. Dreams, this is where they usually start with telling us information, is they usually come into our dreams. I met a little girl today who is 6, and she has dreams of her uncle that passed about 2 years ago or so. But it's one of those, like, she has dreams about him coming in and talking to her all the time. And so I was here talking with her, and her family was like, does she really see him? And I was like, mm-hmm. She really does. And it's one of those, like, she has like this special connection that almost like some of the other family members are almost like a little jealous of, because she still has that connection with him where everybody else feels like he's lost or gone. Support system. We have a lot of support system, and a lot of times we are not really kind of using our support system. We have archangels and guardian angels to help us through the grieving process. And I think really sometimes one of the important things is understanding that they're there to help us through the grieving process, but they're there for everybody. So talking to someone else's angels and guides, if they're not really moving through the process, letting them know, like, wow, this person is really not moving through this. Is there something I can do to help or assist them to kind of move through? And a lot of times I will suggest my clients go to counseling. Sometimes that can be a really good one to kind of move through some of that grieving process. My next card is trust. Trust that this is kind of like, and it's hard to say, it's kind of like their life purpose, that they were finished. If they weren't finished, they may not have gone. Either they were completely finished with what was going on, or they were ready to let this life go. I see that a lot with young people that are kind of like, my life is really going bad, that they'll kind of, and I'm not talking about committing suicide. I'm like, everything is not going well, so I'm ready to kind of let this go and kind of retry for another time. Children, I think someone losing their child is probably the hardest ones. The ones that people I have talked to, when they lose a child, no matter if the child was stillborn, miscarriage, or that child lived for a period of time and then passed, all the way to grown-up children with kids of their own and a wife and husband or whatever it is. A lot of those people are like, it's the hardest to lose a child. I have been told this many times. I've fortunately not had that happen to me, but it's one of those, I have heard that this is the worst pain, is to lose a child. Because I think at some point we're kind of ready, you know what I'm saying? Like, we kind of know, like, our parents are older than us and our parents are going to pass. But I think losing a child can be one of those really, really difficult ones. Archangel Michael. A lot of times, one of the people angels I tell people to call on more than anything else is Archangel Michael. And he's not our grieving angel. We have other angels to help with that. But I will tell you, a lot of times when you are grieving, your energy is really low. It's just part of what's happening. And so if you call in Archangel Michael to keep your energy protected, that will really help. It will really assist you to kind of like feel protected as you go through this process, dealing with other people's process, how they're working through things or how they're not working through things. A lot of times this can be very, very helpful to work through the grieving process, to call in Archangel Michael. Or if you know of someone who's lost a family member and they have been disconnected with their family or having a hard time dealing with family, sending Archangel Michael can be an amazing thing to do and help them feel a little bit more protected. Balance. This is kind of our talk about, is kind of balancing your grief and your anxiety of what you're going through during a loss, and balancing that with someone else's, and not judging, but being balanced with that, allowing their energy to be okay. It's okay for them to feel sad. It's okay for them to feel overwhelmed. It is okay for all of this to happen. It's just not okay to kind of stay in that energy for too long. So it's one of those, make sure that they are moving through the process and that they are gaining ground in this area and feeling kind of like uplifted a little bit. Sometimes like that can be something, laughing about something funny or bringing up memories of that person, funny, that sort of thing. Like I said, and being truthful about it, kind of like, oh my gosh, they were the craziest person. They did this, that, and the other thing, because it kind of makes that person feel like they're still around and still involved in what is going on. Okay, guys, I thank y'all so much for joining me tonight, and I know that we'll be talking again soon.